1. Joyce Meyer's story is often presented as one of transformation, a journey from deep personal pain to global influence. For decades, she has spoken to audiences around the world about emotional healing, faith, and personal growth. Her teachings have reached millions through books, television, and conferences. Yet behind the polished stage presence and structured messages lies a much more complicated and deeply human narrative. It's a story shaped not only by resilience but also by struggle, controversy, and ongoing public scrutiny. Understanding her journey requires looking beyond the surface and examining both the hardships she endured and the challenges that came later in life. She was born Pauline Joyce Hutchison in St. Louis, Missouri in 1943, during a time when the world itself was in turmoil. Her early life began with absence, as her father left to serve in World War II shortly after her birth. When he returned, the family dynamic had changed in ways that would deeply affect her childhood. In later years, Joyce shared that her home environment became a place marked by fear rather than safety. According to her own accounts, she experienced repeated abuse over a prolonged period. These experiences, she has said, left emotional scars that would take decades to fully confront and understand. One of the most significant aspects of her early life was not just the trauma itself, but the silence surrounding it. She has spoken about feeling isolated, unable to speak openly about what was happening. That silence, she has suggested, shaped her personality and coping mechanisms in profound ways. As a child, she learned to function outwardly while dealing with internal turmoil. This contrast between public normalcy and private pain became a recurring theme in her life. It influenced how she interacted with others, how she viewed trust, and how she processed authority and relationships. As she grew older, these unresolved experiences began to manifest in different ways. Joyce has openly acknowledged that she struggled with anger, control, and emotional instability during her early adult years. These were not random traits but responses shaped by years of fear and suppressed emotion. Even her early exposure to faith did not immediately provide relief. While she identified with Christianity from a young age, she later explained that it felt more intellectual than transformative at the time. The deeper emotional healing she would later speak about had not yet taken root. After graduating from high school, she entered her first marriage, hoping it would provide a way out of her difficult home environment. Instead, it introduced a new set of challenges. The relationship, as she later described it, was marked by instability and poor decisions. Her husband's behavior, including dishonesty and infidelity, created further emotional strain. During this period, she also made choices she later regretted, including being involved in financial wrongdoing under pressure. Although she eventually took responsibility and made amends, the experience added another layer of guilt and self-reflection to her journey. The collapse of her first marriage marked a turning point, but not an immediate recovery. Instead, it led into a period she has described as emotionally chaotic and uncertain. She has spoken candidly about trying to cope through distractions rather than healing. Nights spent in social settings, unhealthy habits, and unstable relationships became ways to temporarily escape deeper pain. It wasn't about recklessness for its own sake, but about finding relief from memories that continued to surface. This phase of her life reflects a pattern seen in many trauma survivors: the attempt to manage inner wounds without yet having the tools to truly address them. In 1967, she married Dave Meyer, a man who would eventually become a central figure in both her personal life and ministry. At the time, however, stability did not come overnight. Joyce has acknowledged that she entered this marriage carrying unresolved emotional baggage. Trust issues, defensiveness, and controlling tendencies shaped her behavior in ways that tested the relationship. Dave, by her account, responded with patience and consistency, which gradually created an environment different from what she had previously experienced. This contrast played an important role in helping her begin to recognize patterns in herself that needed to change. Nearly a decade into her second marriage, she describes experiencing a profound spiritual moment that reshaped her perspective. In 1976, she has said she felt a deep sense of connection with God during a time of intense personal reflection. She often refers to this as a moment when faith became real rather than theoretical. It did not erase her past, but it marked the beginning of a different approach to dealing with it. Instead of suppressing pain, she began to confront it through spiritual teachings, self-examination, and a growing commitment to change her behavior. This shift gradually influenced her involvement in church activities. She became active in a local congregation in Missouri, eventually stepping into leadership roles. What set her apart early on was her willingness to speak openly about her struggles. Rather than presenting a perfect image, she shared personal experiences of anger, fear, and failure. This honesty resonated with people who felt disconnected from more traditional, polished forms of preaching. Her approach suggested that faith could coexist with imperfection, and that growth was an ongoing process rather than an instant transformation. Her early teaching opportunities were modest, often taking place in small, informal settings. She led Bible studies in everyday environments, speaking to groups that were more intimate than institutional. These sessions allowed her to develop a communication style that was direct and relatable. Instead of focusing on abstract theology, she emphasized practical application, how beliefs could influence daily decisions, emotions, and relationships. This grounded approach became a defining feature of her later work, helping her connect with audiences who were looking for guidance in real-life situations. In 1985, she made a significant decision to step away from her formal church role and start her own ministry. It was a risk, especially given the limited resources and uncertain future. The early days of what would become a global organization were simple. She began with a short radio program broadcast on a local station in St. Louis. There were no large production teams or elaborate setups. It was just her voice, her message, and a growing audience that found value in what she shared. This period reflects how many large movements often begin quietly and without widespread recognition. As her radio presence expanded, so did her audience. Listeners were drawn to her straightforward way of addressing complex emotional and spiritual issues. She spoke about topics like negative thinking, self-discipline, and personal responsibility in a way that felt accessible. Her ability to combine personal testimony with practical advice created a sense of authenticity that resonated across different demographics. Over time, the program began reaching beyond local boundaries, establishing a regional and eventually national presence. The transition to television in the early 1990s marked another major step in her journey. Moving into this medium required greater resources and introduced a higher level of visibility. It also meant increased scrutiny. Despite these challenges, the program gained traction and was eventually broadcast to a much wider audience. The show, later known as Enjoying Everyday Life, maintained the same core message but reached viewers on a much larger scale. This expansion significantly amplified her influence and positioned her as a recognizable figure in religious broadcasting. Alongside her media presence, her work as an author began to grow. One of her most well-known books focused on the role of thoughts in shaping behavior and emotional well-being. It offered readers a structured way to identify and challenge negative thinking patterns. The book's success contributed to her rising profile and opened doors for further publishing opportunities. Writing allowed her to reach audiences who may not have encountered her through radio or television, extending her impact even further. As the ministry expanded, it developed multiple branches, including humanitarian initiatives and outreach programs. These efforts aimed to address practical needs such as food distribution, disaster relief, and community support. Supporters often point to these initiatives as evidence of the ministry's broader mission beyond teaching. However, growth on this scale also brought increased attention to organizational structure, funding, and accountability. What had started as a small operation was now a complex institution with global reach. With increased visibility came a shift in public perception. Joyce Meyer was no longer seen solely as a speaker sharing personal experiences. She had become a prominent figure within a larger conversation about faith, influence, and leadership. Supporters viewed her as an example of resilience and transformation. Critics, on the other hand, began raising questions about certain teachings and the financial aspects of large ministries. This dual perception is common for public figures whose influence extends across different audiences and belief systems. The discussion around prosperity theology became one of the focal points of criticism. Some observers argued that certain messages within this movement could create unrealistic expectations about the relationship between faith and material success. Over time, Joyce herself addressed these concerns, clarifying aspects of her teaching and acknowledging that life's challenges are not always directly tied to belief. These statements reflected an effort to refine her message in response to both personal reflection and public feedback. Financial transparency also became a topic of public interest as the ministry grew. Reports highlighting salaries, assets, and expenditures drew attention from media and watchdog organizations. Supporters argued that large-scale operations require significant resources to function effectively. Critics questioned whether certain expenditures aligned with the expectations of a nonprofit organization. These debates are not unique to one ministry but are part of a broader discussion about accountability in organizations that rely on public support. The attention eventually reached political levels, with formal inquiries requesting detailed financial information from several ministries including hers. Joyce Meyer Ministries responded by providing documentation and making adjustments to certain financial practices. No legal violations were ultimately established, but the situation left a lasting impression on public perception. For many observers, it reinforced the importance of transparency. For supporters, it was seen as a challenge faced by a high-profile organization operating under intense scrutiny. Despite these challenges, her influence continued. Conferences, broadcasts, and publications remained central to her work. Her message continued to focus on personal growth, discipline, and faith as tools for navigating life's difficulties. At the same time, the complexities surrounding her public image became part of her broader narrative. She was no longer just telling a story of past struggle, she was living through ongoing challenges in real time. Another difficult chapter emerged through events connected to individuals within her organization. A tragic criminal case involving a member of her security team brought unexpected attention to the ministry. Although she was not personally accused of wrongdoing, the association placed the organization in the spotlight once again. Situations like this highlight how public figures can be affected by actions within their wider professional network, even when they are not directly responsible. In later years, decisions regarding media partnerships also reflected an awareness of accountability and public trust. When concerns arose involving a broadcasting network, her ministry chose to step back from that platform. The decision was framed as aligning with values of integrity and responsibility. For some, this reinforced her commitment to addressing difficult issues. For others, it raised additional questions about the complexities of operating within large media ecosystems. Looking at her journey as a whole, it becomes clear that it cannot be reduced to a single narrative. It includes elements of survival, personal growth, success, and controversy. Each phase of her life adds a layer to the overall picture. For supporters, her story represents the possibility of transformation. For critics, it raises important questions about leadership, influence, and accountability. Both perspectives contribute to a more complete understanding. Ultimately, Joyce Meyer's life reflects the challenges of moving from private struggle to public influence. The same experiences that shaped her message also became part of the scrutiny she faced. Her story continues to evolve, shaped by both her own decisions and the broader environment in which she operates. Whether viewed through a lens of inspiration or criticism, it remains a complex and ongoing narrative that invites continued discussion. As Joyce Meyer's influence expanded into the late 1990s and early 2000s, her ministry entered a phase where growth was no longer gradual, it was exponential. Television broadcasts reached international audiences, her conferences filled large venues, and her books continued to sell in significant numbers. With this expansion came a level of visibility that few religious figures achieve. She was no longer speaking primarily to small groups or regional listeners. She was addressing millions across different cultures, languages, and backgrounds. This shift transformed her from a teacher with a compelling story into a global brand associated with faith-based self-improvement. The structure of her organization evolved to support this scale. What began as a small outreach operation developed into a multi-departmental ministry with media production, publishing coordination, event management, and humanitarian divisions. These systems required leadership, staffing, and financial planning at a corporate level. Supporters often pointed out that such growth allowed the ministry to reach more people and expand its charitable efforts. At the same time, critics began to question whether the organizational model resembled a business more than a traditional nonprofit ministry. One of the defining aspects of her message during this period was its focus on practical living. Rather than centering exclusively on doctrine, she emphasized daily habits, emotional discipline, and mindset. This approach appealed to individuals looking for actionable guidance rather than purely theological teaching. Her ability to translate spiritual ideas into everyday language became a major factor in her popularity. For many followers, her teachings felt less like sermons and more like structured advice for navigating personal challenges. Her book publications played a critical role in reinforcing this influence. Titles focusing on thought patterns, emotional control, and personal responsibility became widely recognized. These works were often positioned as tools for self-reflection, encouraging readers to examine how their internal dialogue shaped their external experiences. The accessibility of her writing style allowed her message to reach beyond traditional religious audiences, attracting readers who might not typically engage with church-based teaching. As her profile grew, so did the financial scope of her ministry. Revenue streams included book sales, conference tickets, donations, and media distribution agreements. Managing these resources required infrastructure similar to that of large organizations in other industries. While supporters viewed this as a natural result of success and demand, others began to scrutinize how funds were allocated. Questions emerged about compensation, property ownership, and operational expenses. Media investigations during the early 2000s brought these questions into the public eye. Reports highlighted details about housing arrangements, travel methods, and interior design choices within ministry facilities. These descriptions often focused on the contrast between the message of spiritual growth and the appearance of financial comfort. For some observers, this contrast raised concerns about whether the ministry's lifestyle aligned with its teachings. For others, it was seen as an example of how success can be interpreted differently depending on perspective. The conversation extended beyond media coverage into broader public debate. Advocacy groups and watchdog organizations began analyzing financial disclosures and calling for increased transparency among high-profile ministries. Their goal was not limited to one individual, but reflected a wider concern about accountability in organizations that receive public donations. Joyce Meyer Ministries became one of several prominent cases discussed within this context. In response to growing attention, the ministry made efforts to clarify its financial practices. Statements emphasized compliance with existing regulations and highlighted the percentage of resources directed toward outreach and humanitarian work. Adjustments were also made to how income was structured, particularly in relation to book royalties and organizational compensation. These changes were presented as steps toward maintaining clarity and reducing potential misunderstandings. The involvement of government oversight added another layer to the situation. Requests for documentation required the ministry to provide detailed records of expenses, governance structures, and internal policies. While no formal charges were ultimately filed, the process itself reinforced the importance of transparency in large-scale operations. It also demonstrated how quickly public influence can lead to institutional scrutiny. For Joyce Meyer personally, this period represented a shift in how she was perceived. She was no longer viewed solely through the lens of her personal story or teaching style. Instead, she became part of a larger conversation about leadership within modern religious movements. This shift required navigating not only her message, but also the expectations placed on her as a public figure managing a global organization. Despite these challenges, her core message remained consistent. She continued to focus on the idea that individuals have the ability to change their thinking patterns and improve their lives through discipline and faith. This continuity helped maintain her connection with longtime followers, even as external discussions about her ministry evolved. For many supporters, the consistency of her message reinforced their trust in her work. At the same time, critics argued that consistency alone did not address structural concerns. They pointed out that influence carries responsibility, particularly when it involves financial contributions from a wide audience. This perspective emphasized the need for ongoing evaluation rather than one-time responses to criticism. The debate highlighted the complexity of balancing personal teaching with organizational accountability. Another dimension of her ministry during this time was its humanitarian outreach. Programs aimed at providing food, medical assistance, and disaster relief became an important part of its public identity. These initiatives were often cited as evidence that the ministry's impact extended beyond teaching into tangible action. Supporters viewed this as a demonstration of values in practice, while critics questioned how resources were proportioned between outreach and operational costs. The dual narrative of success and scrutiny created a dynamic that followed her throughout this phase of her career. On one hand, she continued to expand her reach and influence. On the other, she operated under increasing observation from both supporters and skeptics. This balance is common for individuals leading large organizations, where achievements and criticisms often grow in parallel. Public perception during this period became more divided. For some, she represented resilience, discipline, and the possibility of personal transformation. For others, she became a symbol of broader concerns about commercialization within religious spaces. These differing viewpoints did not cancel each other out but instead contributed to an ongoing conversation about the role of modern ministries. Her ability to continue operating within this environment suggests a level of adaptability. Rather than retreating from public attention, she remained active in broadcasting, writing, and speaking. This approach allowed her to maintain relevance while addressing challenges as they arose. It also demonstrated a willingness to engage with both support and criticism. Internally, managing such a large organization likely required continuous adjustment. Leadership decisions, financial planning, and communication strategies all played roles in sustaining operations. While much of this work occurred behind the scenes, its impact was reflected in the ministry's ability to continue functioning at a global level. The broader context of this period also included changes in media consumption. As digital platforms began to grow, the way audiences engaged with content started to shift. This transition presented both opportunities and challenges for established broadcasters. Adapting to these changes became part of maintaining long-term influence. Looking at this stage of her journey, it becomes clear that growth brought complexity. The same factors that enabled her to reach millions also introduced new expectations and responsibilities. Success was no longer measured solely by audience size, but also by how effectively the organization addressed questions about transparency and impact. By the end of this phase, Joyce Meyer had established herself as one of the most recognized figures in her field. Her journey from local teacher to global influencer was complete, but it came with an evolving set of challenges. The foundation she built would continue to shape the next chapter of her story, where personal history, public influence, and external events would intersect in unexpected ways.